was supposed to be a day of love, a day of romance, of flowers and shared dinners. But for Veronica Moran and her two children, February 14th would become a day of unimaginable horror. A day that would haunt the hearts of those who love them forever. This is a Valentine season, and the screams from Mrs. Moran's room keep coming alive. What happened inside Mr. Moran's very home has changed lives, and not just those of the victims. This Valentine's Day turned into a nightmare no one could have predicted. How could a day meant to celebrate love turn into a brutal tragedy? What pushed a man to take the life of his own wife in front of their children? Let's dive deep into the tragic events that unfolded that fateful morning. Veronica Moran was 35, a mother, a sister, and a friend to many. She had dreams of a peaceful life, of raising her children in a loving home. Daniel Moran, her husband, 40, was a man who once seemed perfect for her. Together, they built a family. But no one knew what was hiding beneath the surface. For years, their marriage appeared stable. But as the years passed by, cracks began to form. Veronica had grown tired of Daniel's possessiveness, of the emotional turmoil that weighed heavy on her heart. She made the difficult decision to leave, a decision that would soon lead to disaster. For months, the relationship between Veronica and Moran had been on the brink. The spark they once shared had been replaced by resentment, by the realization that they were no longer the people they once were. Veronica's decision to separate wasn't made lightly. It was the only option left. But Daniel couldn't accept it. What should have been a simple conversation became an act of violence. On Valentine's Day morning, Daniel Moran arrived at the house. His mind was already set on confrontation. He would not let go of his wife, not without a fight. Veronica had known this day would come. She had been preparing herself for it. But no one could have predicted what was about to happen. The faint sound of children's laughter echoed from down their room. Veronica Moran could hear the playful chatter of her two kids, Chloe and James, as they played in their rooms, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing in the kitchen. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her movements slow, methodical, as though she could somehow will away the tightening in her chest. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, Valentine's Day, a day of love, of warmth, a day she had always looked forward to with her family. But today there was something off. Daniel, her husband, had been quiet all morning, too quiet. His silences were growing longer, his presence heavier. The man who once filled the house with laughter and affection had become a shadow in their home, always lurking, always watching. She didn't hear him approach. The first thing she knew he was there was the coldness of his voice, cutting through the air like a knife. "Veronica, who was that man you were talking to at the store?" Daniel's voice was low, tight with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't the voice of the man she married. This voice, this tone, was something darker, something unfamiliar. Her heart skipped a beat, the spoon in her hand freezing mid-stir. She didn't have to ask which man he was talking about. She had seen him at the grocery store, a friendly acquaintance from the neighborhood who had stopped her to chat for a moment. Nothing more. But in Daniel's eyes, that casual conversation had already morphed into something forbidden. Her mouth went dry as she turned to face him, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "Daniel, it was just Steve. We were catching up. Nothing more." His gaze was sharp, unblinking. "Nothing more, huh?" His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I saw the way you looked at him, Veronica. I saw that little laugh. You think I didn't notice?" Veronica's stomach twisted, the old familiar fear creeping into her. "I didn't." She took a step back, trying to keep her voice steady, but the knot in her throat made it hard to speak. "It was just a friendly conversation. You're overreacting." But Daniel didn't seem to hear her. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto hers with a predatory intensity. "A friendly conversation?" he repeated, his voice rising, breaking with something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I haven't seen what's been going on? You think I don't know what you're doing behind my back?" She wanted to argue, to explain, to tell him that he was imagining things. But the words stuck in her throat. caught by the cold, suffocating grip of his presence. The Daniel she once knew, the man who held her in his arms and promised to love her forever, was gone, replaced by a stranger who looked at her as though she were already guilty. "Daniel, please!" Veronica's voice faltered, her eyes welling with tears she hadn't expected. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't do this. It's not like that." But the tears didn't seem to move him. They never did anymore. "You think you can fool me? You think you can just smile at him, laugh with him, and I won't notice? I gave you everything, Veronica. I loved you. But now I see how you look at him. I see how you're slipping away from me." His words were venom, each one cutting deeper than the last, and Veronica could feel the walls around her closing in. She reached out, her hand trembling, trying to hold on to something, anything that might make him see reason. "Daniel, please. I love you. I've always loved you. You're just not seeing things clearly." He took a step toward her, his breath quickening. "You love me?" His voice dropped to a whisper, low and dangerous. "Then why were you smiling at him? Why were you laughing with him like you laugh with me?" Veronica shook her head, the tears finally slipping down her cheeks, a mix of frustration and fear choking her. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, I swear." But there was no reaching him now. The man she once knew was no longer standing in front of her. He was a stranger, consumed by jealousy and rage, and she was powerless to stop him. The kids were still in their rooms, their laughter now drowned out by the harshness of Daniel's voice, Chloe's giggles, James's excited shouts. They didn't know what was unfolding in the kitchen. They didn't know how quickly everything was unraveling. And then, in one swift motion, Daniel's hand went to his coat pocket, pulling out the cold steel of a gun. The sight of it sent a shock through Veronica's body, a jolt of terror that froze her in place. She opened her mouth to scream, to call for help, but the words never came. Don't make me do this," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking, the gun now pointed directly at her. Veronica's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of her children, Chloe, James, their innocent faces, unaware of the storm brewing just outside their doors. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel, please, let's talk. Please, let's just talk." But he didn't hear her. He didn't see her. He only saw the betrayal he believed had already happened. And before Veronica could take another breath, before she could say another word, a shot rang out, louder than anything she had ever known. Daniel Moran, in a blind rage, fired, and he kept firing. Veronica collapsed, a mother, a wife, gunned down in her own home. But Daniel wasn't finished. His obsession, his anger consumed him. It echoed through the house like a thunderclap, and then there was silence. Chloe's laughter stopped, James's excitement died, and Veronica Moran's world came to an end. In an instant, Veronica's life was stolen from her, and for her children, the horror was something they would never be able to erase. Daniel Moran fled the scene, leaving behind a shattered family, 2 children, and a mother who would never see another Valentine's Day. The investigation began almost immediately, and it didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. For the children, this would be a day they would never forget. The trauma of watching their mother die would stay with them forever, and the scars it left on the community of Houston, a place known for its warmth, would never heal. It didn't take long for the police to piece together the horror. Daniel Moran, in his fit of jealousy and rage, had killed his wife. The signs of a toxic relationship were evident in the aftermath. But what drove him to this? Was it the feeling of betrayal? Or was it the inability to let go of someone he once loved? Detective Lauren Jameson, who had been one of the first officers to arrive on the scene, had never seen a case quite like it. As a seasoned investigator, she had witnessed all kinds of tragedy, but this one felt different. The brutality of the crime, the emotional weight of the aftermath, it was all-consuming. She had been the one to comfort Chloe and James, holding them as they cried, trying to make sense of their mother's death. And yet, the more she investigated, the more complicated it became. It wasn't just a case of a crime of passion. There were layers to Daniel Moran's rage, years of emotional abuse, instability, and unresolved resentment that had built up over time. Veronica's decision to leave had been the breaking point, but in truth, the cracks in their relationship had been evident for years. Veronica's death left a hole that could never be filled. Her family, her children, her friends, they all mourned the loss of a woman whose life was cut short by a senseless act of violence. The community of Houston was left asking one question: how could love turn so deadly? Daniel Moran's actions on that Valentine's Day changed everything. The love that once existed between him and Veronica was replaced by jealousy, rage, and violence. And while the legal system has played its part, the emotional scars will remain forever. But the question remains: how could something that began as love end in such brutality? Could it have been prevented? What warning signs did those around them miss? This tragedy is a chilling reminder of the dangers of emotional instability, jealousy, and unaddressed trauma. Daniel Moran vanished into the shadows of the city. A manhunt stretched across Texas. The public, gripped by the chilling tale of a Valentine's Day, turned to carnage. For weeks he ran, but no amount of distance could wash the blood from his hands. Justice was coming for him, and it would not be kind. Cut to a mugshot. Daniel Moran, eyes hollow, his once proud posture now slumped in defeat. Captured, forced to face the children whose lives he had destroyed. Injustice? The courtroom was quiet as Daniel Moran sat at the defendant's table, his once proud frame now hunched, his face a pale reflection of the man he once was. The gravity of the situation had finally settled on him, but it came too late. His soul had been eroded by jealousy, rage, and the deep fractures of his own unresolved pain. He had done the unthinkable, and now in front of a crowd of spectators, his life would be judged. But no matter the outcome, nothing would ever bring Veronica back. His children, Chloe and James, had been brought to the courthouse, but they were seated far from the chaos that filled the room. Relatives surrounded them, offering silent support, but there was no comfort for their broken hearts. They had not asked for any of this. They had not wanted a courtroom to be their new reality. Their mother's face, smiling and warm, was now a ghost in their memories, and all that was left was the agony of what they had witnessed. The horror of that Valentine's Day morning. A day meant for love, twisted into a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Daniel Moran's background, though not immediately obvious to those who first met him, was shaped by years of emotional turmoil and unhealthy influences that played a significant role in his eventual breakdown. Growing up in a broken home, Daniel's understanding of love and relationships was skewed from the very beginning. He was the product of a marriage that had crumbled long before he was old enough to understand why. His father, a stern and often distant man, was quick to anger and slow to offer affection. His mother, on the other hand, was an emotionally withdrawn woman, worn down by years of conflict and neglect. She often retreated into silence, and Daniel learned early that love was not about comfort, care, or mutual respect. It was a power struggle, a constant tug of war for control, affection, and dominance. In his home, love was transactional, and it was always conditional. As a child, Daniel grew up watching his parents bicker and argue, and he was left to deal with the fallout of their toxic marriage. His father would often lash out in anger when things didn't go his way, while his mother withdrew emotionally, accepting her husband's behavior as the norm. There were never tender moments in their home, never the reassurance of unconditional love that children need to feel safe and secure. Instead, Daniel learned that relationships were fragile, easily destroyed, and filled with conflict. By the time he was a teenager, Daniel had internalized a disturbing view of marriage. He saw it not as a partnership of equals, but as a structure in which one person must dominate the other. He began to view women as possessions, something to be controlled and kept, not cherished or understood. He believed that once he had committed to someone, that person was his, and the relationship was a reflection of his control, his dominance. In his eyes, love was synonymous with ownership. Daniel's first serious relationship in his 20s mirrored the dysfunction he had witnessed in his own parents' marriage. His girlfriend at the time had eventually broken things off, unable to deal with his possessiveness and emotional volatility. She had tried to explain that he was stifling her, but Daniel couldn't see it. He thought her desire for independence was a betrayal, a sign that she no longer loved him. This rejection only fueled his deepening insecurity and bitterness. In his mind, love was about control, and if someone tried to pull away, it was an affront to everything he believed in. When he met Veronica, she represented everything he thought he wanted. She was warm, caring, and seemingly willing to devote herself to him. They built a family together, and for a while Daniel believed he had finally found someone who would make him feel secure, someone who would never leave. But his internalized beliefs about relationships and love were always lurking beneath the surface, influencing his actions in subtle, dangerous ways. What he couldn't control, he feared, and as their marriage grew, his possessiveness over Veronica grew stronger, his jealousy more apparent. She was no longer just his partner. She was his property. The tipping point came when Veronica decided to leave. For Daniel, this was more than just a relationship unraveling. It was an existential crisis. He couldn't fathom the idea that she no longer wanted to be his, that someone could reject him after everything he had given her. To him, her desire for separation was a direct challenge to his sense of identity and control. It wasn't just the end of their marriage, it was a rejection of his entire worldview. In his mind, Veronica was abandoning him because she had found someone else, someone better, someone who could offer her what he couldn't. He became obsessed with the idea that she had betrayed him, even if there was no concrete evidence to suggest she had done anything wrong. The truth was irrelevant. The feeling of being abandoned, of losing control, was too much for him to bear. As Daniel prepared for the confrontation on Valentine's Day, he wasn't thinking clearly. His rage wasn't just about Veronica's conversation with Steve. It was the culmination of years of unresolved anger and frustration. Years of living in a world where love meant control, where loyalty was demanded but never earned, and where every failure of a relationship felt like a personal attack. His anger was no longer about Veronica. It was about everything he had suffered growing up, all the times he had felt abandoned, neglected, or betrayed. He could not bear to face the reality that his own actions, his own toxic beliefs about love, had led to the unraveling of his marriage. Instead, he sought to force Veronica back into the mold he had created for her. He needed to feel that control, to reassert himself in a world that had grown increasingly out of his grasp. When Daniel pulled that gun on Veronica, it wasn't just an act of jealousy. It was the final, violent expression of everything he had been taught about love. It was the culmination of years of feeling abandoned, powerless, and rejected. It was about maintaining control at any cost. And as he pulled the trigger, he believed he was taking back something that was rightfully his, something he felt he could no longer live without. Daniel Moran's brutal behavior on that Valentine's Day was the result of a lifetime of emotional neglect, toxic beliefs about relationships, and a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement. His inability to accept Veronica's decision to leave was not just about losing a wife, it was about the loss of his identity, his control, and his understanding of what love was supposed to be. And in the end, it was that broken mindset, that twisted view of love as ownership and possession, that led him to commit an unforgivable act of violence. What excuse could best justify this cold murder? At the other hand, Veronica Moran's story wasn't just one of love and heartbreak. It was a story shaped by a tragedy long before she met Daniel. Veronica was an orphan from a young age. Her parents had tragically passed away in a car accident when she was just 6 years old, leaving her to navigate a cruel world without the comforting presence of a mother's hug or a father's protective embrace. She had been sent from one foster home to another, each one colder and more indifferent than the last, never knowing what it truly felt like to be loved or cared for in the way that every child deserves. Her childhood was spent in the shadow of uncertainty, moving from one temporary home to another. She was passed off like a forgotten piece of furniture, with only brief moments of warmth or kindness from strangers who could never replace the parents she had lost. No matter how many times she was given a place to stay, Veronica never truly had a home. But there was one thing that kept her going: the hope of building a family of her own. As she grew older, she dreamed of a love that would fill the empty spaces left in her heart. She wanted to be the mother to her children that she never had, to give them a life filled with warmth, stability, and love. She wanted them to know the joy of a home, not the cold loneliness she had known all too well. When she met Daniel, it seemed like fate had finally brought her the love she had always longed for. At first, he was everything she thought she needed: kind, loving, and attentive. Together, they built a family. Chloe and James were her world, and for the first time, she felt as though she had something solid, something to hold on to. But that love, which had seemed so promising, slowly began to wither, replaced by control and possessiveness. As the years passed, Veronica began to realize that her marriage to Daniel was no longer a refuge, but a prison. She had tried to talk to him, to make him understand the pain she was feeling. But the man who had once promised her the world was now the one suffocating her with jealousy and emotional abuse. She felt like a possession, her every move monitored, her every action scrutinized. Yet she couldn't leave. And it wasn't just because of the love she still felt for Daniel, though that was part of it. No, Veronica stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She had no family to turn to, no mother, no father, no siblings to lean on. After losing her parents so young, she had built a life with Daniel, but now in the cold reality of her marriage, she realized just how alone she truly was. The thought of leaving him meant facing an even harsher world, a world where she would be completely isolated, with no one to support her or her children. For years she endured, trying to keep her family intact for the sake of her children. She hoped that one day things would get better, that maybe Daniel would change, that the love they once shared would return. But as the years wore on, the weight of her situation became unbearable. She had hoped for peace, for a simple life, but she was trapped in a cycle of emotional turmoil and fear. And so, on that fateful Valentine's Day, when Daniel showed up at her door, she was already emotionally drained. She had been fighting a battle for years, a battle not just for her marriage, but for her very sense of self. She had given so much of herself to Daniel, trying to hold on to the love that had once existed between them, but it had all been in vain. When the confrontation began, she knew in her heart that there was no way out. The tragic truth was that Veronica, who had lived most of her life without a home, was now being denied the only sense of refuge she had left. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go, nowhere to turn. She endured not for herself, but for her children. And in the end, it was the very thing she had hoped to protect that was taken from her in the most brutal way. Her death left her children with no home to return to, no family to turn to, and no solace to comfort them in their grief. The love that had once bound them was now shattered, and the children were left with nothing but the haunting memory of a woman who had only wanted to give them a better life. Veronica Moran's life was a painful journey of survival, of trying to find love in a world that had never shown her kindness. And in the end, it was the absence of that love, the absence of family, that would define her final days. Her children, Chloe and James, would forever carry the weight of their mother's tragedy, a tragedy shaped by the loss of love and the absence of the one thing Veronica had always longed for, a home. And every Valentine's Day, as they face a world without her, they will remember the woman who fought so hard to build a life for them, a life that was stolen in an instant, leaving them with nothing but the broken pieces of a love that was never meant to be. At last, Daniel Moran was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A gavel slams. Life in prison. But there is no victory in this courtroom, only the ghost of a mother who should have been there. His trial became a media spectacle, with the public hungry for answers. How could a man who once loved his wife do such a thing? The emotional toll was not just felt by the family, but by an entire community left shaken by the tragedy. Veronica had been a mother who lived for her children. Her joy was in their laughter, their well-being, their future. Every day she woke up with the hope that her love and care would be enough to shield them from the world's darkness. But on that tragic morning, the world had failed her. It had been taken from her in the most brutal of ways, and now her children would be forced to face the harshness of a world without her guiding hand. The night before the murder, Daniel Moran had made a desperate attempt to reconcile with his wife. He had called her, begged her to reconsider the separation, to come back home. But Veronica had stood her ground. She had told him she could no longer live like this, that the love they once shared had turned into something toxic. She had tried to explain, to reason with him, but Daniel could not accept the truth. In his mind, she was his possession, his property, and no one, not even her, had the right to decide their fate but him. By the time he arrived at the house the next morning, he had made up his mind. He was going to win her back at any cost. But when he confronted Veronica, he didn't see the woman he once loved. Instead, he saw betrayal. The simple conversation she had had with Steve, the man from the store, had twisted into a full-fledged affair in Daniel's eyes. His jealousy consumed him. His anger clouded his judgment. And that's when the tragedy unfolded. The verdict in a future stained by tragedy. Chloe, who had been just 6 years old, clung to the memories of her mother's smile, the sound of her voice, and the warmth of her embrace. Every Valentine's Day, she would remember the woman who had loved her so fiercely, the woman who had promised to protect her. But now that promise was broken. James, a few years older, had been too young to fully grasp the violence of that day. But he would remember the silence that followed the chaos, the screams that had turned into stillness. He would remember the emptiness in the air, the absence of his mother's comfort. The trauma would stay with them, following them into adulthood, marking them with a scar that would never heal. The children, now in the custody of relatives, stare blankly ahead. They do not understand justice. They only understand loss. Years passed, but for Chloe and James, the wounds never fully healed. The trauma they had endured, the loss of their mother, the cruel twist of fate that had ripped her from their lives, was a burden they could never escape. Every corner of their world felt tainted by the tragedy. Every room in every house, every street they walked down, seemed to whisper with the ghost of what had once been. Love, once an innocent thing, now carried with it the sharp edge of loss, and the children were left to navigate a world that no longer made sense. Chloe was now a teenager. She carried herself with a heaviness that was well beyond her years. Her once bright smile had been replaced by a constant frown, the weight of her grief pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible boulder. She had inherited Veronica's beauty, but the spark in her eyes had dulled. She was a quiet girl now, always shrinking away from attention, hiding her pain behind a wall of silence. She wasn't the carefree child she had once been. That girl had died the moment her mother's life had been stolen from her. James, too, had been irreversibly changed. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface when he was younger had only grown with time. At first, it was an innocent kind of rage, a child's inability to understand the depth of his loss. But as he got older, the anger turned darker, more destructive. He had withdrawn from his peers, from the world around him, retreating into a shell of his own creation. But even in his isolation, the pain was relentless. The boy who once reveled in the warmth of family had grown cold and bitter, lost in a world that had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. But it wasn't just the death of their mother that had stolen their childhoods. It was the abandonment that followed, the cruel, slow unraveling of everything they had once known as home. Veronica's relatives, the ones who were supposed to step in and offer the children solace, had instead stripped them of everything. In the wake of Daniel's capture and incarceration, the family's properties, their house, their possessions, everything Veronica had worked for, was swiftly taken. Her siblings and distant relatives saw an opportunity to seize what was left behind, and they did so with a coldness that matched the cruelty of the world they had just experienced. Veronica's home, once filled with love and laughter, was sold off. The proceeds funneled into the pockets of those who claimed to be family, but had shown no care for the children who were now left with nothing. The house, their mother's sanctuary, was gone, replaced by an empty space where memories once lived. No one thought about the children. No one asked if they had a place to go. No one cared that Chloe and James were now orphans with no money and no home. They were passed from relative to relative, each home colder and more indifferent than the last. Chloe and James had become invisible, mere afterthoughts in a world that had moved on. They were shuffled between strangers, living in homes that felt more like prisons than places of refuge. And the bullies, the ones who never knew the depth of their pain, were everywhere. At school, at church, even in the streets, they were mocked, whispered about, and made to feel as though their very existence was an inconvenience to those around them. Chloe, a quiet target, endured the harsh words and cruel jabs, her classmates taunting her with reminders of her mother's violent death. They never considered the fact that her heart was still breaking. They never realized how deeply her wounds ran. They called her the girl with the dead mother and laughed when she would flinch at the mention of Valentine's Day. Her classmates didn't know what it felt like to live in a world where every holiday, every special occasion, was a painful reminder of the family they had lost. Their home was gone. Their mother was gone. And though Daniel Moran would rot in a prison cell, they were the ones left to carry the weight of his crime. Every Valentine's Day, the world celebrates love. But for Chloe and James, it will always be the day their world ended. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, seek help. Love should never hurt. If this message resonated with you, let's spread awareness together. Like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share your thoughts, your voice matters. And subscribe for more powerful stories.